Greetings and good evening, beautiful people. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope you're having a fantastic day and week. Welcome to our live weekly YouTube readings of the final report of the California Reparations Task Force right here on the CJEC YouTube channel. This is the only live reading of the California Reparations Task Force final report on YouTube. The final report of the first in the nation California Reparations Task Force is one of, if not the most important government reports about the Black American community since the 1960s. Equally important is also the foundation for current and future reparations legislation in California. The report is nearly 1,100 pages long, and we're bringing every page of it to you, chapter by chapter, every week on Thursdays at 7 p.m. Pacific, so that you are properly educated in your advocacy for reparations in California. Today's reading of the final report is presented to you as a community service with support from the Reparations Organizing and Mobilizing Team at the Coalition for a Just and Equitable California. CJEC is California's leading grassroots organization born for reparations and reparative justice for Black American freedmen living in California. For more information on CJEC and our work helping to enact the law that created the California Reparations Task Force, California's law requiring state agencies to collect data on descendants of U.S. slavery, the Act to End Current Slavery in California State Prisons, the California Freedmen Affairs Bill, and more, visit www.cjec-official.org. Before we go any further, right now, I need you to do three things. First, connect to our YouTube channel by liking this video, hitting that bell for reminders, and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Second, get connected to us on social media by following CJEC on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter, at CJEC Official. Finally, get informed and involved. To do that, visit www.cjec-official.org to sign up for current and accurate California reparations news and info on our Get Involved page, and support our work by volunteering and/or donating. To donate, just click the Donate tab on the homepage of our website. Special thanks to our amazing fiscal sponsor, the California Black Women's Health Project. You can learn more about our fiscal sponsor, the California Black Women's Health Project, at www.cabwhp.org. By way of introduction, my name is Iris. I live in Santa Rosa and I'm from the Bay Area, California, and I'm a volunteer reparations advocate with CJEC's Reparations Organizing and Mobilizing Team. The agenda for today is Chapter 39 of the final report of the California Reparations Task Force. The title of the chapter we're reading tonight, Chapter 39, Unjust Legal System, Statutes and Case Law. You can follow along in the reading, download tonight's chapter, or the full final report yourself by going to our website, www.cjec-official.org/reports. Okay, we're about ready to start our reading, but before we do, I have some special thanks and announcements to make. First, as always, I'd like to thank our good friends at ETM Media Group on YouTube for their live readings of the first California Reparations Report. You can watch the readings of the first report on their channel at ETM Media Group on YouTube and on our website at www.cjec-official.org/videos. Second, for those of you who don't know, historic reparations legislation in California is here and more is coming. SB 490 is California's first lineage-based reparations-related legislation to establish the Freedmen Affairs Agency. The bill was introduced by State Senator Stephen Bradford and will move forward this year. To read the bill, visit www.cjecofficial.org/advocacy. Third, as mentioned, More historic reparations bills are coming. Over the next several months, more reparations bills will be written. During this 2024 legislative season, we'll see those bills introduced and start moving forward. Passage by majorities of both the California State Assembly and Senate. To pass reparations bills in 2024, we need 41 Assembly members and 21 senators to say yes. When those bills are passed, we need our governor to sign the bills. So, to make reparations a reality in California, the math is 41 plus 21 plus 1. That's 41 Assembly members, 21 senators, and one governor. 41 plus 21 plus 1 equals reparations in California. Lastly, but not least, special thanks to CJEC's reparations organizing and mobilizing team, specifically our volunteer final report readers. And without further ado, Chapter 39 of the California Reparations Task Force Final Report. Chapter 39, Unjust Legal System, Statutes and Case Law. 1. Federal Statutes and Case Law. 1787, an ordinance for the government of the territory of the United States northwest of the River Ohio, Northwest Ordinance of 1787, Article the 6th. Summary of the law. Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 outlawed slavery and involuntary servitude north of the Ohio River in the Northwest Territory unless imposed as punishment for an offense for which an individual had been duly convicted. The ordinance also allowed an enslaver to reclaim an enslaved person or fugitive who escaped to the Northwest Territory from one of the original states where slavery was lawful. Impact of the law. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory, the area that eventually became the states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. The ordinance also introduced the fugitive slave law into American jurisprudence. This provision ensured that a person enslaved in a state that permitted slavery could be captured and returned to enslavement if that person escaped to one of the states or territories in which slavery was outlawed. Subsequent history. In 1789, the Northwest Ordinance's fugitive slave provision was included in the United States Constitution in Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3 as the Fugitive Slave Clause. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 was passed to enforce the Fugitive Slave Clause. 1789, U.S. Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, Fugitive Slave Clause. Summary of the law. The Fugitive Slave Clause, which was patterned after the Fugitive Slave Provision in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, was part of the Constitution that became effective in 1789. The clause guaranteed the right to reclaim an escaped enslaved person from any territory within the United States. It specifically provided that no enslaved person shall be discharged from enslavement by escaping to a state that did not practice slavery. It also guaranteed the right of an enslaver to reclaim the fugitive enslaved person. Impact of the law. The Fugitive Slave Clause elevated the right to own and enslave human beings to a property right protected by the Constitution and enforceable by the federal government. The clause authorized enslavers to pursue and reclaim any enslaved person who escaped, even when they escaped to a state that prohibited slavery. States were prohibited from interfering with the right to pursue and reclaim, ensuring that a person who was enslaved in one state was enslaved everywhere in the United States. Subsequent history. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 to enforce the rights granted by the Fugitive Slave Clause. The 1793 Act allowed federal judges and state magistrates to decide without a jury trial whether an individual was a fugitive enslaved person. Congress later passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which imposed harsh penalties for failure to enforce the fugitive slave laws and for assisting a fugitive. 1790, the Naturalization Act of 1790, First Statute 103. Summary of the law. The 1790 Act created a process for granting citizenship to immigrants who were free white persons and had resided within the jurisdiction of the United States. The residency requirement was 2 years, and the application could be made to any common law court in any state where the persons resided for at least 1 year. The other requirement were proof to the satisfaction of the court that the immigrant was a person of good moral character and the taking of an oath to support the Constitution of the United States. The children of the person who became a citizen who were residing in the United States and were under the age of 21 at the time the court approved the application automatically became citizens. Children of U.S. citizens born outside of the United States were deemed natural born citizens of the United States. Impact of the law. The 1790 Act created a process to allow, quote, free, unquote, white immigrants to become citizens of the United States. The law also granted automatic citizenship to their children. At that time, African Americans could not become American citizens. Subsequent history. The 1790 Act was repealed and replaced by the 1795 Act to establish a rule of uniform naturalization, which increased the length of the United States residency requirement to 5 years. 1793, an act respecting fugitives from justice and persons escaping from the service of their masters of 1793. Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Summary of the law. Congress enacted the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 to enforce rights guaranteed by the Fugitive Slave Clause. The act authorized federal judges and magistrates to hold summary proceedings to determine the status of an alleged fugitive enslaved person. In these proceedings, the alleged enslaved fugitive had no right to a jury trial. In addition to proceedings to reclaim their, quote, property, unquote, the 1793 Act also authorized enslavers to bring private suits in federal and state courts to recover damages from anyone who interfered with the right to reclaim or who assisted an escaped enslaved person. Impact of the law. The 1793 Act ensured that the constitutional right of enslavers to own other human beings was enforced by the national government. A person enslaved in a slave state remained an enslaved person even if they escaped to a state that prohibited slavery. Subsequent history. The 1793 Act was repealed when Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The 1850 Act imposed harsh penalties for those who did not enforce the law or assisted in an alleged fugitive. The Fugitive Slave Acts were repealed on June 28, 1864. 1798. An act in addition to the naturalization laws of the United States. 1798, First Statute 566. Summary of the law. The 1798 Act repealed and replaced the Naturalization Act of 1795. The 1798 Act increased the citizenship residency requirement from 5 years to 14 years for those who became residents after January 29, 1795. Unlike the prior acts, Its text did not explicitly limit application for citizenship to free white persons. It prohibited immigrants from enemy countries from becoming citizens. It also required white immigrants residing in the United States to register with the nearest place authorized to register immigrants within 48 hours of entering the United States. Impact of the law. The law was passed in conjunction with several other laws in anticipation of the United States going to war with France. Its immediate impact was to discourage immigration into the United States. It also created a registry of foreign white nationals within the United States. Subsequent history. The 1798 Act was repealed by the Act to establish a uniform rule of naturalization of 1802. 1802, an act in addition to the naturalization laws of the United States, Second Statute 153. Summary of the facts and issues. The Act to establish a uniform rule of naturalization of 1802 repealed the 1798 Act and reestablished the 5-year residency requirement from the 1795 Act. Like the 1790 and the 1795 Acts, the 1802 Act explicitly limited the application for citizenship to, quote, free white persons, unquote. Impact of the law. The 1802 Act repealed the 1798 Act. The 1802 Act explicitly restored language from the 1795 Act that only immigrants who were, quote, free white persons, unquote, could apply for citizenship. This language preserved the constitutional understanding of citizens as white persons and the exclusion of African Americans and, quote, Indians not taxed, unquote, from citizenship. The act also decreased the residency requirement to apply for citizenship from 14 years to 5 years. Subsequent history. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born within the United States, including African Americans. 1820, Missouri Compromise. Summary of the law. In 1803, France sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States. Missouri was part of the territory and later sought admission into the Union as a slave state. The Missouri Compromise sought to keep the balance in the Union between enslaving and free states equal and therefore simultaneously admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a non-slave state. The compromise also prohibited slavery above the 36 latitude, 30 longitude, 30, excuse me, above the 3630 latitude in the rest of the Louisiana Territory. Impact of the law. The immediate impact of the Missouri Compromise was that Missouri, a territory that practiced the enslavement of human beings, and Maine, a free state, were admitted at the same time. The compromise kept the balance between the number of states that practiced the enslavement of human beings and those that did not. It also reinforced the enslavement of human beings as a valid institution future states could adopt and still be admitted into the Union. Subsequent history. In Dred Scott versus Stanford, 1857, 60 U.S. 393, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the part of the Missouri Compromise that prohibited slavery in parts of the Louisiana Territory was unconstitutional because Congress had no authority to ban slavery from a federal territory. The court found that a right to traffic in slavery, quote, like an ordinary article of merchandise and property, was guaranteed to the citizens of the United States in every state that might desire it. And the government, in express terms, is pledged to protect it in all future time if the slave escapes from his owner, end quote. The Constitution did not give, quote, Congress a greater power over slave property or which entity's property of that kind to less protection that property of any other description, end quote. Congress also repealed that part of the Missouri Compromise in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The Josefa Segunda 18 U.S. 338. Summary of facts and issues. In 1807, the United States outlawed the importation of enslaved people into the United States. Violations of the 1807 Act resulted in forfeiture of the vessel to the United States, and any persons found on the vessel that were intended to be sold into slavery will be delivered to parties within the respective state designated to receive them. During the war between Spain and its colonies, the Josefa Segunda was seized by the United States in the Mississippi River with enslaved captives on board. The registered owners brought a claim for return of the ship and the people on board. They claimed that the ship was pirated and was only in U.S. waters because of necessity or distress. The court held that the plaintiff's claims of necessity and that the ship was pirated did not meet the required level of proof. It upheld the lower court's order finding that the vessel was forfeited and ordered the delivery of the enslaved captives to the appropriate persons within Louisiana. Impact of the ruling. The ruling affirmed the 1807 Act outlawing the importation of enslaved people into the United States. But even though the 1807 Act outlawed the importation of enslaved people, when ships were confiscated under the Act, the passengers were often sold into slavery within the United States. Thus, not only did the 1807 Act not end slavery, it created an avenue for the domestic slave trade to persist. Subsequent history. In United States versus Preston, 1830, 28 U.S. 57, a subsequent related proceeding, Louisiana filed a claim to the proceeds from the sale of the enslaved persons found aboard the the Josefa Segunda. The United States government opposed Louisiana's claim. The district court awarded the proceeds to Louisiana, and the United States appealed. The Supreme Court reversed. It held that an 1819 law, which was passed while the first appeal was pending and prohibited the sale of enslaved persons illegally imported into the United States, applied to Louisiana's claim. Therefore, Louisiana was not entitled to the proceeds from the sale of enslaved captives. 1824, the Merino, 22 U.S. 391. Summary of facts and issues. Congress enacted 3 laws that prohibited the international slave trade. The first, the Act of 1794, prohibited the building and commissioning of vessels within the United States that would be used to procure free persons to be trafficked as slaves or would be used to traffic persons who were already held in slavery. The Acts of 1800 and 1818 prohibited citizens of the United States from facilitating the slave trade by allowing their vessels to be used in service of the trade between different countries. 3 American ships carrying enslaved people, the Constitution, the Merino, and the Louisa, were captured by American officers while traveling from Havana, Cuba to Pensacola, Florida, which at the time was under Spain's control. The Constitution was later seized a second time off the coast of Mobile, Alabama, by a revenue officer of the United States. The United States brought an action to condemn all 3 of the vessels and acquire custody of the enslaved persons based on the Act of 1794, 1800, and 1818. The district court condemned the vessels and the enslaved people found aboard the vessels to the United States. On appeal, the United States Supreme Court affirmed in part and reversed in part. As to the Constitution, the court affirmed the condemnation of the vessel and the cargo aboard, not including the enslaved persons found on board. As to the enslaved persons, the enslavers were entitled to make a claim for restitution because At the time of the second seizure, the vessel was not engaged in the traffic of enslaved persons. It was being transported for the proceeding. The court also reversed that part of the order condemning the Moreno and the Louisa because the information alleged only that the persons on board were being held as slaves, which the evidence did not prove. Instead, the evidence proved that there were being transported to, quote, held to service, unquote, which the 1818 Act also prohibited. And because the evidence would support that finding, the court remained or remanded for the United States to amend the information to state, quote, held to service and for further proceedings. Impact of ruling. The court's decision made clear that transporting people of African descent to be held to service, even if they were not to be held in slavery, violated the 1818 Act. The court's decision to also exposed a loophole in the 1800 Act, which allowed a person holding an interest in enslaved people aboard a condemned vessel to make a claim for restitution if the vessel was in possession of a non-commissioned captor at the time it was captured by the United States. Here, the decision held that the enslavers could make a claim because at the time of the second seizure, the vessel was not being used to traffic people for slavery. 84 enslaved people were thus returned to slave owners by the United States government. The St. Hugo de Cuba, 22 U.S. 409. Summary of facts and issues. Several sailors and individuals with financial interests in an American vessel that was condemned by the United States for participating in the slave trade brought claims for wages and materials and labor used to repair the vessel. The district court held that the interest in the cargo was not forfeited and sustained the claim for wages of one seaman and claims for repairs by some of the materialmen. The Supreme Court reversed. The court held that the facts that supported the condemnation of the vessel also supported condemnation of the cargo. Specifically, the ship was, quote, fitted out, unquote, for the slave trade. The court also reversed the claims of the claimants for wages and repairs because the record did not establish that claimants were unaware that the ship was an American ship engaging in the slave trade. Impact of ruling. The Supreme Court's decision made clear that no one involved in the preparation of an American vessel for the slave trade or involved in operating the vessel would receive compensation from the sale of a vessel after it has been condemned if they were placed on notice of the vessel's involvement in the slave trade. Quote, the general policy of the law is to discountenance every contribution, even the minutest kind, to this traffic in our ports, and the act of engaging seamen is unequivocal preparatory measure for such an enterprise, end quote. 1825, the Antelope, 23 U.S. 66. Summary of facts and issues. The vice consuls of Spain and Portugal brought claims to recover enslaved persons that an American vessel pirated from ships belonging to both countries. The owner of the alleged pirate vessel also filed a claim to recover the enslaved persons, as did the United States. The United States argued that because the enslaved persons has been transported from, quote, foreign parts by American citizens in contravention to the laws of the United States, end quote, based on the laws of the United States, enslaved persons were entitled to their freedom. The lower court dismissed the claim of the owner of the American vessel and sustained the claim of the United States as to the enslaved persons found on the American vessel. The remaining enslaved persons would be divided between Portugal and Spain. The United States appealed. The Supreme Court held that the right to restitution of enslaved people on a vessel depended on whether the law of the country to which the vessel belonged sanctioned the slave trade. Quote, If that law gives its sanction to the trade, restitution will be decreed. If that law prohibits it, the vessel and cargo will be condemned as good price, end quote. In this case, because no owner from Portugal came forward to prove ownership of any of the enslaved persons, and owners from Spain were able to do so, the enslaved persons would be divided between the United States and Spain. Impact of ruling. The court declared that the international slave trade does not violate either the principles of international law nor, unless prescribed by some treaty, positive international law. Accordingly, only domestic law regulates the international slave trade in the United States, and that law prohibits seizing property outside of domestic waters. Any property so seized, including enslaved people, must be returned to their owners. However, the court also adopted a presumption that people were free unless a claimant could prove a property right in them. In other words, that they had been lawfully enslaved by the laws of a country. Because Spain permitted the slave trade, the enslaved persons pirated from Spanish ships had to be returned to the owners. The remainder were relegated to the custody of the United States, and because the United States prohibited the slave trade, those individuals would be freed and returned to Africa. 1841, the Amnistad, 40, U.S. 518. Summary of facts and issues. The Amnistad was a Spanish vessel that set sail from Havana, Cuba to Puerto Principe, another port on the island of Cuba, with 49 African captives and 2 Spanish nationals who claim to own the captives on board. During the voyage, the African captives mutinied, killing the captain and taking control of the vessel. The vessel was captured by an American ship off the coast of Long Island. The Spanish nationals filed a claim of restitution, claiming that the Africans were their property. The Attorney General filed a claim on behalf of Spain for the restitution of the Africans. The 49 Africans filed an answer claiming that they were native born Africans who had been kidnapped. They were not slaves. The district court denied the Spanish nationals' claim. It ordered the captives to be delivered to the President of the United States so that he could return them to Africa. The Court of Appeal affirmed the decree. The Supreme Court affirmed in part and reversed in part. It agreed that neither the Spanish nationals nor Spain had a right to restitution because the 49 Africans were free persons who had been kidnapped and brought to Cuba to be sold into slavery. The court rejected as fraudulent the documents the Spanish nationals produced to prove the African captives had been sold to them. It reversed that part of the decree that required the African captives to be delivered to the president so that they could be returned to Africa because they were the ones in control of the vessel when it was captured. The African captives were not brought to the United States in violation of any anti-slave trade laws. They were free foreign nationals, and as such, they were entitled to an immediate release. Impact of the ruling. The court's decision to recognize the inherent right of human beings to be set free, to be free. It also recognized the lawfulness of the mutiny because African captives had the right to preserve their freedom and prevent their captors from selling them into slavery. And the decision ordering the immediate release of African captives without requiring them to be transported back to Africa also recognized their rights to be present in the United States as any other foreign national. They were eventually returned to their homeland. 1842, Prigg versus Pennsylvania, 41 U.S. 539. Summary of the facts and issues. The petitioner filed a post-conviction petition challenging his conviction for kidnapping a woman and her children from Pennsylvania and returning them to Maryland, where the woman had been enslaved. He pursued and captured the fugitive enslaved woman as the agent of the woman who claimed to own her. He was arrested and charged under a Pennsylvania law that prohibited people from kidnapping an African American and selling them into slavery or holding them as a slave. The Supreme Court held that the kidnapping statute was unconstitutional because it interfered with an enslaver's constitutionally protected right to reclaim a fugitive enslaved person from any jurisdiction within the United States where that person may be found. Quote, the Fugitive Slave Clause manifestly contemplates the existence of a positive, unqualified right on the part of the owner of the slave, which no state law or regulation can in any way qualify, regulate, control, or restrain. The slave is not to be discharged from service or labor in consequence of any state law or regulation. Impact of ruling. The Supreme Court's decision established that the Fugitive Slave Clause and the Fugitive Slave Act 1793 protected an enslaver's constitutional right to own another human being by affirming that an enslaver had the right to seize and reclaim an escaped enslaved persons whenever that escaped person may be found. The court's decision also affirmed that a state, even one where enslavement of human beings is prohibited, had an obligation not to interfere with or punish an enslaver's exercise of their constitutional right to reclaim a fugitive enslaved person. Subsequent history. Congress enacted the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which imposed harsh penalties for assisting an enslaved person in escaping or interfering with the right to reclaim a fugitive enslaved person. The Fugitive Slave Acts were also repealed on June 28, 1864. 1848, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. Summary of the law. The treaty, which was signed on February 2nd, 1848, officially ended the Mexican-American War. In the treaty, Mexico agreed to cede territory to the United States, territory which eventually became the states of California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and parts of Arizona, Colorado, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. Mexico also agreed to relinquish claims to Texas. The treaty recognized the Rio Grande River as the border between Mexico and the United States. Articles 8 and 9 also gave Mexican citizens within the ceded territory the option of becoming American citizens. Impact of the law. The treaty ended the war between the United States and Mexico, allowing the United States to expand its territory in the West. The treaty offered American citizenship to Mexicans within the ceded territory. African Americans who had been in the United States since its founding remained ineligible for citizenship. Until 1930, people of Mexican descent in the United States were considered white for purposes of the census. Subsequent history. The territory ceded by Mexico to the United States as a result of the treaty reignited concerns about the balance between free states and enslaving states. These tensions led to the enactment of two additional laws that would govern the future admission of the slave and free states into the Union. One, the Compromise of 1850, which admitted California as a free state and allowed admission of Utah and New Mexico without a designation as free or enslaving states. And two, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed citizens in both territories to decide the inclusion or exclusion of slavery within their boundaries by popular vote. 1850, Compromise of 1850. Summary of the law. The Compromise of 1850 consisted of 5 bills aimed at easing the tensions created between the northern and southern states by the acquisition of new territory following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The 5 bills that made up the compromise included a bill that required California to be accepted into the Union as a free state, a bill that required Texas to give up some of its land in exchange for a $10 million debt assumption by the federal government, a bill that created the states of New Mexico and Utah using some of the land that Texas relinquished and that organized those states without mentioning slavery, a bill abolishing the slave trade in Washington, D.C., even though slavery continued within the jurisdiction, and an amendment to the Fugitive Slave Act that increased penalties for those who helped enslaved people escape or interfered with the right to recapture enslaved persons. Impact of the law. California was admitted as a free state and Texas borders were reconfigured to its current boundaries. Several of the measures included in the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it easier for enslavers to claim that an African American was an escaped fugitive person. In 1850, the 1850 Act only required a sworn statement alleging ownership to trigger the arrest of an alleged fugitive enslaved person. Building on the 1793 Act's denial of the right to a jury trial for an alleged fugitive in these proceedings, the 1850 Act prohibited an alleged fugitive from even testifying on their own behalf. These new measures spurred an increase in kidnapping of, quote, free, unquote, African Americans who would then be sold into enslavement. African Americans who were free had to carry papers with them to prove their status. The 1850 Act also imposed harsh penalties, including heavy fines and imprisonment for those who refused to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act or assisted an enslaved person in escaping. Bennett versus Buttersworth, 49 U.S. 124. Summary of facts and issues. The plaintiff filed an action to recover 4 enslaved persons from the defendant. In his pleadings, the plaintiff alleged that the value of the enslaved persons was $2,700, but at the trial, the jury awarded plaintiff $1,200. Plaintiff released the judgment and the defendant appealed to the Supreme Court. Plaintiff moved to dismiss on the grounds that the $1,200 in controversy did not meet the Supreme Court's threshold for jurisdiction. The Supreme Court denied the motion to dismiss the appeal because the plaintiff's own complaint alleged the value of slaves being to be $2,700, so he could not deprive the defendant of a writ of error where he has released the judgment of an amount below the amount in controversy threshold. Impact of ruling. The Supreme Court's decision reinforced the idea of African Americans as property. The value of human beings was used to undermine whether the court would exercise jurisdiction over disputes involving human beings and property. Randon versus Toby, 52 U.S. 493. Summary of facts and issues. Plaintiff brought suit to recover 2 promissory notes executed by the defendant. One defense the defendant raised was that the notes were executed for enslaved persons who were imported into the United States in violation of the law. And because the enslaved persons were in the United States unlawfully, he did not receive adequate compensation in exchange for the notes. The court held that the fact that enslaved people may have been illegally imported into the United States does not render subsequent contract for the buying and selling of those enslaved African Americans void, especially in a slave state where color is sufficient presumptive evidence that the person is a slave. The crime committed by those who introduced the enslaved people into the country does not attach to subsequent purchasers. Impact of the ruling. The court's decision affirmed that a person may receive the title enslaved, the title to enslaved people imported into the United States in violation of the anti-slave trade laws. If the enslaved people had challenged their enslavement in court, however, the defendant likely would have had a defense against the plaintiff for for want of consideration or breach of an implied warranty of title. Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Summary of law. The 1850 Act repealed the 1793 Act. It eliminated the right of an alleged fugitive enslaved person to testify on their own behalf in the proceedings to determine their status. It imposed heavy penalties on federal marshals who did not enforce the law and on individuals who aided an alleged fugitive enslaved person. A person who helped an enslaved person by providing shelter and food faced 6 months imprisonment and $1,000 fine. The act also provided cash incentives for the judges and magistrates to find that the person was a proven fugitive. Impact of the law. The 1850 Act also sought to strengthen the rights of enslavers to reclaim the fugitive enslaved persons by limiting the right of the alleged enslaved person to defend themselves during proceedings, by incentivizing judges to rule in favor of finding the person to be a fugitive, and by imposing harsh penalties on those officials who refused to enforce the law and those who helped an enslaved person escape or avoid recapture. Another significant impact of the 1850 Act was that the provisions precluding alleged fugitives from defending themselves during the proceedings spurred the kidnapping and trafficking of free African Americans into slavery. African Americans who were free had to carry papers with them to prove their status. Subsequent history. The Fugitive Slave Acts were repealed on June 28th, 1864. 1854. Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Summary of the law. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was enacted to relieve the tension between free states and those states that practice enslavement of human beings by establishing rules for admitting states into the Union that kept balance between states and a slave state. And it revealed that some of the tension by repeating the part of the Missouri Compromise that prohibited slavery above the 3630 latitude in Louisiana Territory. Impact of the law. The Act's requirement that Kansas would decide by popular vote whether it would be a slave or free state led to quote, a migration of pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions, end quote, to Kansas seeking to influence the decision about slavery, resulting, quote, in a period of political chaos and bloodshed, unquote. During this period, which was known as a Bleeding Kansas, approximately 55 people were killed. Subsequent history. Eventually, Kansas voted no, voted to, excuse me, subsequent history. Eventually, Kansas voted to enter the Union as a free state. 1857, Dred Scott versus Sanford, 60 U.S. 393. Summary of facts and issues. The plaintiff, an enslaved person, filed a petition seeking to be declared a free person because he lived in Illinois, a free state, while his enslaver was stationed there. In a second matter, the plaintiff brought a claim for assault based on his new enslaver's assault on plaintiff and plaintiff's family. The Supreme Court held the plaintiff could not bring either claim because he was not a citizen. Quote, neither the class of persons who have been imported as slaves nor the descendants, end quote, were included in the group of people that could become citizens of the United States. Quote, they had, for more than a century before, been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the right race, either in a social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, end quote. The plaintiff's status as an enslaved person was determined by laws of Missouri, not the rights, not Illinois. And the enslaved person, and as an enslaved person, he could not exercise the rights of a citizen and sue in court for his freedom. The court also held that the part of the Missouri Compromise that prohibited slavery in parts of Louisiana Territory unconstitutional because Congress did not have the authority under the Constitution to prohibit slavery in any federal territory. Impact of the ruling. The decision stated that African Americans were not citizens of the United States, could never become citizens, and did not have the same rights as citizens, such as bringing a claim to the courts. The court also affirmed that the Fugitive Slave Clause protected an enslaver's right to possess an enslaved person. And because of the Fugitive Slave Clause, once a person was enslaved in one state, they were enslaved everywhere else in the United States. Subsequent history. The court's decision was superseded by the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, which granted citizenship and other rights to African Americans. 1859, Abelman versus Booth, 62 U.S. 506. Summary of facts and issues. The defendant was convicted before a commissioner of aiding and abetting an enslaved person to escape from a marshal in violation of Fugitive Slave Act 1850. The defendant applied to the state Supreme Court for a writ of habeas corpus on the grounds that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was unconstitutional. The writ was granted the same day. Shortly after the defendant was released, he was indicted by a grand jury in the federal district court for the same act. Following a trial, the defendant was convicted and incarcerated. He filed a petition for writ of habeas corpus in the state Supreme Court. The court issued the writ and decided that the defendant's imprisonment was illegal. The United States Supreme Court reversed both the state Supreme Court's decision that declared the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 unconstitutional The United States Supreme Court explained that while a state court can issue writs of habeas corpus within its territorial jurisdiction, it cannot issue writs to the federal courts. Moreover, the United States Supreme Court, not a state court, has the final authority to interpret and apply federal law. Impact of ruling. The United States Supreme Court's decision upheld the constitutionality of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, including the penalties for adding an alleged enslaved person to avoid being captured. It also affirmed that state tribunals cannot overrule federal courts on matters of federal laws. The decision was one of the major cases and supported enslavers' property rights in enslaved people leading up to the Civil War. And that will conclude tonight's reading of Chapter 39 of the California Reparations Task Force Final Report. Before you go, if you haven't done so already, don't forget to like this video, hit the bell for reminders, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. When you go, don't forget to get connected. Follow CJEC on all social media, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and Twitter at CJEC Official. Get informed. Visit www.cjec-official.org and sign up for current and accurate California reparations news and info on our Get Involved page. Get involved. Support our work by volunteering and or donating. To donate, just click the donate tab on the homepage of our website. Special thanks to our amazing fiscal sponsor, the California Black Women's Health Project. Thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate you all. We are closer to reparations than we have ever been in California. Have a great night.